Hello, I'm Dale the Real Seeker, and welcome back to Real Seekers. This is the Real Seekers Beyond here. We're moving on with Lecture 7 of my Logic and Critical Thinking class. Okay, so here's a review of our last lecture in lecture number 6. So remember, I gave you the 7-step process for turning an argument into reconstructing an argument in standard form, which is a helpful way of organizing an argument into its premises and conclusions and sub-arguments as well. Yep, you have mark all the premise and conclusion indicator words and ignore any extraneous statements, number all the statements. And I'll just say here, I should have reversed these because I think it's best. Step 1 is better to number all the statements first and foremost. And remember with that, you separate the conjunctions and disjunctions. That's really important for argument reconstruction when doing diagramming. Step 3, identify the main conclusion of the argument. Step 4, identify any explicit and or implicit premises that directly support the main conclusion. Step 5, decide whether these are dependent or independent premises. Step 6, determine whether there are any sub-arguments and repeat steps 3 through 5 for them. Finally, step 7, put it into standard form. And at all times, as you go through these steps, you're utilizing the principle of charity, which has those two aspects. You want to make the argument as strong as possible, as deductively strong, or as inductively strong as possible without violating the principle of fairness, whereby you fairly and considerately represent the intentions of the author. No better, no worse, what they intend to argue and say. Now, today's, we're going to be turning to a more helpful technique that's better for visual learners. So with standard form, it's all written, you've got premises, it's kind of like a math equation almost, and stuff like that. You even have the math symbol for therefore that you can use. Some people just don't learn that way. That works for me, but others are more visual, artsy people. They're sometimes visual learners. And that's why we have what are called argument diagrams to help us make sense of jumbled up arguments that we encounter in the real world. Now, argument diagrams are kind of like a roadmap of an argument. Okay, so it's a visual tool that offers a graphic depiction of the argument's logical structure. And it shows the logical inferences we make from the premises to the conclusions and highlights those logical connections that make up the argument. Here's just an example of an argument diagram and what they look like. So you can see here, circles represent a conclusion. All right, you put any conclusion, a sub-conclusion or a main conclusion, as a circle. So in this case, 6 is the main conclusion. Arrows represent logical inferences, the logical moving, right, from premises to conclusion. Squares represent premises. So 7 is a premise, 8 is a premise, 9 is a premise. And in this case, you underline it because all 3 of these are dependent premises. They depend on each other. If take away one of the premises, you can't draw that arrow and infer the truth of the main conclusion 6. All 3 together depend on each other. And if all 3 are there, only then can you infer and draw an arrow to the main conclusion of 6. You also have another argument. You have 10 in a square. It's a premise that allows us to logically infer a separate arrow to logically infer 6. And it's there by itself, and there's no underlining or any other premises. So it's an independent premise. Premise 10 by itself allows us to infer or use that arrow the truth of the main conclusion. So that's interesting. There are 2 separate arguments here, 2 arrows that allow us to arrive at the truth of the conclusion in 6. What's interesting is that 10 has a circle around it as well. So it's also a conclusion of what? Well, we see here 11 is a premise. And from there we have an arrow. We logically infer 10 as a sub-conclusion, right? So we have one sub-argument here. 11 and 10 are a sub-argument, with 10 being the sub-conclusion of that sub-argument. So when we have this, when you see a circle and a square, that statement, that means it is both playing a dual role. It's both a sub-conclusion of a sub-argument, and it plays the role of a premise in the main argument itself. Okay, so sub-argument with the circle, and then the square means that it's a premise in the main conclusion, or the main in one of the main arguments. In this case, there are apparently two main arguments here. So that's interesting. So that's a little bit of how argument diagramming works and what these things mean. Okay, so here is a helpful 8-step process when you're doing argument diagramming. And you'll notice that these are the same. Again, you need to apply the principle of charity at all times for all of these 8 steps, but a lot of them are the exact same steps that we had initialized when we were doing putting arguments into standard form. So again, I would swap step 1 and 2. I think the most important thing you should do is number all the statements separately in the argument. That should always be the first thing you do. That's what I would do. Not do step 1 type thing. Do this, then I would go to step 1 and mark all the premise or conclusion indicator words and ignore all the extraneous statements or irrelevant things, stuff that have nothing to do with arguments or anything, okay? Then step 3, identify what the main conclusion of the argument is. Step 4, identify any explicit and or implicit premises that directly support the main conclusion. And remember, in the last lecture, in lecture 6, we went into great detail about techniques and ways that you can go about fulfilling each of these steps, especially step 4, right? Giving you some advice on how to identify, is there an implicit premise or not? Maybe I should look, is there a deductive argument or is there an argument pattern that's being used or implicitly used and stuff like that? Are there premise or conclusion indicator words? Stuff like that. Step 5, decide whether these are dependent or independent premises. Finally, step 6, draw the diagram for the premises and the main conclusion that represent the main argument only. Okay, so draw a diagram of the main argument. Then step 7, then determine whether there are any sub-arguments and repeat steps 3 through 5 for them. Finally, step 8, complete the diagram for the argument and represent it as a whole, sub-arguments and main arguments together. Okay, so let's take a look at some practical examples. Here's one of a simple argument. Okay, so here's our first example. If somebody says to you, if that no-good heretic Davy Russell throws a water balloon at Tyler Fowler, then he will get wet. If Tyler Fowler gets wet, then Davy Russell is liable to get his heretical little butt kicked. Thus, if that no-good heretic Davy Russell throws a water balloon at Tyler Fowler, he is liable to get his heretical little butt kicked. Great, let's follow the steps here for argument diagramming and reconstruction. So let's follow step 2 first, because I think this should be the first step you do. It is for me when I'm argument diagramming, and that makes it easier. But great. Statement 1, if that no-good heretic Davy Russell throws a water balloon at Tyler, then he'll get wet. Remember, conditionals are one statement. We only separate conjunctions and disjunctions into 2 separate statements. So this is an if-then. So, okay, the if-then as a total is one statement. Statement 2 is an if-then. Tyler Fowler gets wet, then Davy Russell is liable to get his heretical little butt kicked. And then statement 3, thus, if that no-good heretic Davy Russell throws a water balloon at Tyler Fowler, he's liable to get his heretical little butt kicked. And great, so we've numbered all the statements. There are a total of 3 statements here. Step 2, which I'm calling step 1, mark the premise and conclusion indicators. Well, there are no premise or conclusion indicator words. There's no premise indicator words, but there is a conclusion indicator underlining thus. That indicates it's a conclusion. So is statement 3, let's pay attention to it, is that serving as the main conclusion? Is that the main thing this person making this argument wants you to believe? You betcha. Yeah. So step 3 is the main, statement 3 is the main conclusion of the argument. If that no good heretic Davy Russell throws a water balloon at Tyler Fowler, he's liable to get his heretical little butt kicked. Okay, going on, steps 4 through 6. Let's identify any explicit and or implicit premises that directly support the main conclusion. Well, does statement 1, does that support? Yep, perfect. Yeah, that's speaking towards the main conclusion there. Statement 2, yep, that's speaking toward the main conclusion there. And guess what we actually see here? Is there any implicit premises? No, statements 1 and 2 together are sufficient to entail the truth of premise 3. And we actually recognize a deductive argument pattern from sentential logic. This is the hypothetical syllogism, the proper hypothetical syllogism, not the messed up versions of modus ponens or modus tollens that David Russell also calls hypothetical syllogism. Remember, we straightened them out in a previous podcast there, or a previous lecture. No, this is the real, the pure hypothetical syllogism deductive argument pattern. And in this case, they're all explicitly stated. All the premises and conclusions are stated. There are no implicit premises needed that are directly supporting the main conclusion. And with step 5, we've determined that 1 and 2 together are sufficient. They are dependent premises to entail the truth of statement 3, which is the main conclusion. There are no independent premises in this argument. Okay, great. So the next step, step 6, let's draw the main argument. So here's the argument. Great. So we have statement 3 is the main conclusion, right? That's represented by a circle. And that's logic. The arrow is the logical inference. So that's inferred from squares or premises. 1, if that no good heretic Davy Russell throws a water balloon at Tyler, then he'll get wet. Okay, that's a premise, square. Here's statement 2, another premise. If Tyler gets wet, then Davy Russell's liable to get his heretical little butt kicked. And these, we said, are both dependent. So we draw a line underneath them. And then we have an arrow. Great, grand, and groovy for the conclusion. So this is very simple. This is the argument diagram. But let's keep going on with our process. Step 7, determine whether there are any sub-arguments and repeat steps 3 through 5 for them. Well, are there any sub-arguments? No, there's nothing. Everything is used in the main argument. So there is no sub-argument here at all given by the author. So how do we complete the diagram? Well, it's the same as above. This is the final diagram because there are no sub-arguments. Excellent. Let's move on to another example. And this one will involve a sub-argument. Somebody says to you, Justin Trudeau has great ideas for preserving the natural environment. That's for sure. Therefore, Trudeau being elected is good for Canada. Remember, Trudeau thought up the Clean Water Initiative, and that is a great idea for preserving the natural environment. All right, let's follow our steps for creating an argument diagram. Okay, start with step 2, number all the statements. Okay, the first statement, Justin Trudeau has great ideas for preserving the natural environment. Statement 2, that's for sure. Well, that's for sure. That's just re-emphasizing statement 1. And remember, logically, it makes no sense to repeat the same premises or statements over again. Stating it just once is logically sufficient. So statement 2 is redundant. We should cross it out. Cross out, that's for sure. That's irrelevant, not relevant to the argument. Throw it in the garbage. Cross it out. Then we have statement 3. Therefore, that is a conclusion indicator word, as step 1 is asking you to do. So underline that. Therefore, Trudeau being elected is good for Canada. 4, remember, Trudeau thought up the Clean Water Initiative. And 5, that is a great idea, preserving the natural environment. So remember, with conditional statements above, like the one about good old Davy Russell, conditionals are considered one statement. You don't separate the antecedent and the consequent into 2 separate statements. But with conjunctions or disjunctions, you do separate them into 2 separate statements. So in this case, with a conjunction, you have 2 conjuncts, 2 separate statements that are conjuncts. Statement 1, Trudeau thought up the Clean Water Initiative. And then statement 2, that is a great idea for preserving the natural environment. So that's why we label them statement 4, remember Trudeau thought up the Clean Initiative, and then statement 5, and that is a great idea for preserving the natural environment. Now, step 3, what is the main idea that this guy wants you to believe as a rational agent? What's the main conclusion in this guy's argument, in his ramblings here about Trudeau? He's clearly politically foolish and stupid. He has no clue what he's talking about. Trudeau is probably the worst prime minister in history. He is horrible. He sucks. The only politician in the world worse than him is creepy, sleepy Joe Biden. Man, we need to get rid of these bums and bring in Trump and Pierre Poilievre. We need to get our country is running like adults again. We can't have these leftist clowns running our country. They're disgusting, quite frankly. So whoever made this argument, he's not too with it. He's obviously a leftist loon. But let's go. This is his argument. So principle of charity, let's go with the lunacy and lean into it and help this guy out to reconstruct his argument here. And he's saying, yep, Trudeau being elected is good for Canada. That's the main conclusion of the main argument. Now, in step 4, we identify, well, what are the explicit or implicit premises that directly support that main conclusion? Well, Trudeau thinking up the Clean Water Initiative. Well, okay, that doesn't help us determine that Trudeau being elected is good for Canada, not in its in statement 5. And that is a great idea for preserving the natural environment. Okay, well, that doesn't get us to Trudeau being elected is good for Canada. Statement 1, that's the only premise here. Justin Trudeau has great ideas for preserving the natural environment. Okay, that could lead to Trudeau's election being good for Canada overall. The main argument here, as explicitly stated, premise 1, and the conclusion is 3. But now we need to look for, is there potentially any implicit premises in the main argument? And I would say yes, because obviously, as explicitly stated, this is a weak, deductively weak and invalid argument, right? I mean, just because Justin Trudeau has great ideas for preserving the natural environment, so what? How does that mean it would be good if he was elected for Canada? Maybe it's bad. People that have great ideas for preserving the natural environment are bad for Canada, right? So it looks like there's an intended missing or implicit premise that we need to add in here. So hypothetically, I could add statement 6. Most elected leaders who have great ideas for preserving the natural environment turn out to be good for Canada. One thing I should note here, I made a mistake. Remember, I said when we're following the principle of charity, we need to follow the quantifiers that are appropriate for what the arguer intends. Now look here, they say therefore. They don't say therefore probably or most likely Trudeau. So technically, I shouldn't have said most elected leaders here. I should say all elected leaders here. This arguer is attempting to make a deductive argument. And therefore, our goal is validity, not cogency. So I made a mistake here, kind of thing. So let me just correct that. All right, so that's good enough for now. But yeah, so I would add statement 6 as an implicit premise. All elected leaders who have great ideas for preserving the natural environment, that should say, are good for Canada. Man, so that's great. And step 5, are these dependent or independent premises? Well, it looks like statement 1 and statement 6 are dependent premises. They depend on each other. And if they're both true, then they both support and imply the conclusion that therefore Trudeau being elected is good for Canada. So let's draw the main argument. Beautiful. Bada boom, bada bing. Statement 3 is a circle. That's the main conclusion. We have the logical inference arrow. We have premise 1 in a square. Justin Trudeau has great ideas for preserving the environment. Statement 6 as an implicit premise we've added, whereby all elected leaders who have great ideas for preserving the natural environment are good for Canada. So excellent. So, and these are dependent. So that's why the line is drawn underneath. And then you have that arrow for logical inference. So let's move on to steps 7 and 8. Determine whether there are any sub-arguments and repeat steps 3 through 5 for them. And then step 8, complete the diagram. Well, here's what we've got so far. And remember, we've added step 6. Okay, so remember, we have the main argument here, but there are 2 statements left over, statements 4 and 5. Remember, Trudeau thought up the Clean Water Initiative, and 5, that is a great idea for preserving the natural environment. These don't speak to the truth, either dependently or independently, to the truth of the main conclusion. But they are supporting something. They see, great at preserving the natural environment. They seem to be speaking to statement 1, that Trudeau has great ideas for preserving the natural environment. So 1 seems to be a sub-conclusion in a sub-argument, with 4 and 5 as the premises in that sub-argument. Great. So let's see how that would look as a diagram for for the full argument, sub-argument and main argument as a whole. So we have our main conclusion, statement 3, Trudeau is good to be elected. Here's what we drew in the other diagrams. The implicit premise, statement 6, all elected leaders who have great ideas for preserving the environment are good to be Canada. And then we have premise 1, which is Justin Trudeau has great ideas for preserving the natural environment. But whoops, there's a circle here too, because 1 is a sub-conclusion in a sub-argument, as we discovered. So it's a circle within a square for statement 1. And it plays that dual role as a premise in the main argument, right? But as the sub-conclusion of a sub-argument, okay? And statements 4 and 5 are premises in squares that are dependent premises on each other, whereby together we can logically infer the truth of the sub-conclusion statement 1 about Trudeau preserving the natural environment. Why do we believe that Trudeau is good for preserving the natural environment as a sub-conclusion? Well, because he thought up the Water Initiative Act, Clean Water Initiatives, and Clean Water Initiative Act is a great idea for preserving the natural environment. Therefore, sub-conclusion, Justin Trudeau has great ideas for preserving the natural environment. And Justin Trudeau having great ideas to preserve the natural environment also serves as a premise in the main argument, along with the fact that all elected leaders who have great ideas for preserving the natural government, that means we know, yep, the election of Justin Trudeau is good for Canada, statement 3. Great, grand, and groovy. So those are the practice examples there. I hope that makes sense. Now, really, with argument reconstruction, it's not rocket science, but many students, this is the most difficult part of the course for them. And especially when you get into complicated arguments with multiple sub-arguments. So the only way to get good at this is through practice. You really need to practice looking at arguments that you come across in the real world, practice putting those into standard form, and practice doing argument diagrams with them. After a while, it'll just become intuitive. You'll be able to recognize the components of arguments and the logical structure of them without needing to resort to these techniques and tactics that I've been teaching you in these last 2 lectures under argument reconstruction. So for the next class, we're going to be leaving behind argument reconstruction and moving on to Unit 4, which is on argument evaluation and evaluating arguments, things like logical fallacies. But before that, I'm going to leave you guys with some homework, 3 questions. And I want you guys to put these arguments into standard form and then do argument diagrams with them. And before we get into the next unit, I will take these 3 up, providing the standard form and the argument diagrams for them. So question 1, somebody argues to you, look, Mayor Leclerc must be corrupt because his behavior suggests that he's either corrupt or incompetent. He's not incompetent, though, because he seems to be very good at getting self-serving bylaws passed by City Council. Put that argument in standard form and then provide me the argument diagram. Number 2, this one's a little bit more complicated. Garfunkel is either a Jabberwocky or a Boogaboo or a Scooby-Dooby-Doo. I don't know what that word says, but I'm not going to sound it out. But he's not a Jabberwocky because he doesn't have jaws that bite. And he's not a Bugaboo because he's not covered in goo. So he must be a Scooby-Dooby-Doo. Then we come to number 3, the hardest of the bunch. And this is the one that pretty much every student gets this wrong when we bring it up in the tutorial classes for SSH 105 or for our critical thinking class. Okay, here it is. Either Lefty committed the crime or Righty did. If Righty committed the crime, then he left fingerprints everywhere. But since Righty was wearing gloves, he didn't leave fingerprints everywhere, which means that we can be sure that he didn't do it. And so, of course, Lefty did it. Now, if Lefty did it, then most detectives were wrong about him. Sherlock is a detective, so there's a pretty good chance that Sherlock was wrong about Lefty. All right, so put these into standard form and provide me with a helpful argument diagram for them. Remember all of the 7 and 8-step processes that I gave you guys. All right, that's it. Like I said, next time we'll be moving on So the first of 2 or possibly 3 at most lectures on Unit 4 about argument evaluation. How do we evaluate arguments to tell? Are they good or bad overall? All right, look out for that next time. And happy Canada Day to everybody, fellow Canadians. And I guess July 4th, happy Yankee Doodle Independence Day for you Yanks. Yeah, have a good time. But it's hard to celebrate a country from which David Russell was born into. So, you got a lot going for you. But yeah, you got David Russell, Joe Biden. I think I'll be celebrating Canada Day. So, all right. Have a great week, everyone, and take care.